stand with me on the plain outside Dara, a fortified frontier city, in June of the year 530. Behind you, roughly 25,000 Byzantine soldiers hold a position dug into the earth itself, rather than arranged for a conventional battle. Across the field, a Persian army reinforced to somewhere near double that number waits to break through what its commanders assume will be an easy victory. Leading the smaller force is a man barely 25 years old himself, given independent command for the first time in his life, about to hand the Persian Empire one of the most complete tactical defeats it has suffered in generations. What does it actually take for a 25-year-old commander, facing an army nearly twice his own size, to win not by matching his enemy's strength, but by making the ground itself fight for him? If you want the real, verified story of the battle that launched the career of the last great Roman general, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. To understand why so much is riding on this specific young commander at this specific frontier post, you have to understand how unusual his position actually is. Belisarius himself comes from nowhere near the kind of background that usually produces Roman generals at this point in the empire's history. Born into an Illyrian or Thracian family, likely of at least partial Gothic ancestry, speaking Latin as his native tongue in an empire increasingly dominated by Greek, he begins his career as a common soldier and rises specifically through service as a bodyguard to the previous emperor, Justin I, rather than through the noble birth or formal education that had traditionally opened this kind of path. Later historians would specifically note how little conventional advantage he actually had compared to the great Roman commanders who came before him. At 25, he has never held independent command of an army this size before. The Byzantine Empire, still calling itself Roman even as its center of gravity has shifted entirely to Constantinople, has been locked in intermittent conflict with the Sassanid Persian Empire along their shared frontier for generations, and Dara itself, a heavily fortified city built specifically to anchor Byzantine defense in this contested region, sits at the center of the current flashpoint. Belisarius shares command with a more experienced officer named Hermogenes, but the tactical decisions that actually shape this battle bear his own name in every source describing it. The wider conflict this battle sits inside, generally remembered as the Iberian War, traces back to a genuinely tangled dispute over the Christian kingdom of Iberia in the Caucasus, a Persian client state that defects toward Byzantine protection partly over religious pressure from Persia to adopt Zoroastrianism against its own Christian population's wishes. Dara itself carries its own long history of provocation predating this specific battle by decades. An earlier Byzantine emperor had ordered the city heavily fortified a quarter-century before this campaign, built specifically as a direct counterweight to Persia's own major fortress city of Nisibis nearby, a fortified frontier post whose very existence Persia had never fully accepted as legitimate. By the time Belisarius takes command here in 530, Dara is already a site loaded with exactly the kind of accumulated resentment that turns a regional dispute into open war. The Persian response makes clear exactly how seriously this frontier crisis is being taken on the other side as well. The Persian king ordering this campaign, Kavadh, brings his own genuinely dramatic history to the decision. Decades earlier, Kavadh had actually been deposed and imprisoned by his own nobility, escaping only with his sister's help before fleeing east to a rival power, the Hephthalites, who supplied him with the army he used to physically retake his own throne. A king who had already lost and reclaimed power once by force is not a man inclined toward caution when a Byzantine fortress on his own frontier looks vulnerable. Kavadh sends an initial force jointly under two commanders, Perozes, holding the senior Persian military title of Myrins, and a second general named Baresmanas, expecting a straightforward campaign. When that combined force alone proves insufficient for Persian ambitions, Kavadh reinforces it further, bringing the total Persian strength under his two commanders to somewhere in the range of 40 to 50,000 men, nearly double the defenders waiting for them at Dara. On paper, this should not be a close contest at all. If the idea that a young, first-time commander's entire reputation rested on a single afternoon against odds this steep interests you as much as it interests us, our members get more of exactly this kind of decision-by-decision breakdown, first and uncut. It's there, whenever you want to go further with us. What Belisarius actually does with his numerical disadvantage is where this battle earns its place in military history, rather than simply becoming one more frontier skirmish. Rather than arranging his smaller force for a conventional pitched battle, where Persian numbers would almost certainly overwhelm him eventually, Belisarius has his infantry dig an elaborate system of trenches across the battlefield, in the days before the fighting begins. This is not a simple straight ditch. The design runs a straight central section flanked by cross trenches set at right angles at each end, with further trenches continuing outward from those junctions, a genuinely complex earthwork specifically built to blunt a cavalry charge across its width, while leaving controlled gaps precisely where Belisarius wants his own counterattacks to actually happen. Persian cavalry, the empire's most feared weapon on open ground, suddenly has to fight on terrain that neutralizes exactly the advantage it was built for. Belisarius arranges his own forces around that earthwork with the same deliberate care, placing his infantry directly behind the central trench where the ground itself does most of the defensive work for them, while his cavalry units hold the flanks, positioned specifically to exploit any gap a Persian advance might create, rather than simply absorbing the initial shock themselves. It is, in effect, a battlefield built in advance to fight exactly the kind of engagement Belisarius wants, rather than the open cavalry clash Persian numbers would otherwise make almost unavoidable. Belisarius's own force is itself a genuinely mixed coalition rather than a uniform Roman army in the old sense, roughly 10,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry, reinforced by allied Ghassanid Arab horsemen and the Heruli cavalry already mentioned. Persia's own army includes its own allied contingents in turn, Lakhmid Arab horsemen and Kadiseni troops, fighting alongside the core Persian force, a reminder that this entire frontier war is, on both sides, fought as much through allied client peoples as through each empire's own core soldiers. Belisarius adds one further piece of preparation that becomes decisive once the fighting actually starts. He positions a unit of Heruli cavalry, Germanic horsemen serving in Byzantine ranks under a commander named Pharos, in a concealed position off his own flank, invisible to the Persian army as it approaches and completely unaccounted for in whatever plan Perozes has prepared for this engagement. Before the main armies actually engage, the two sides trade something closer to theatre than warfare, though it is theatre with genuinely lethal stakes attached. A Persian champion rides forward and issues a formal challenge to single combat, the kind of ritualized confrontation meant partly to test an enemy's nerve before the real fighting begins. The man who answers that challenge from the Byzantine side is, by Procopius's account, not one of Belisarius's senior officers at all, but a bath attendant named Andreas, a household servant who had apparently been training informally alongside Belisarius's own retinue. Andreas kills the Persian champion, and when a second Persian rider issues a fresh challenge shortly afterward, Andreas answers that one too, and wins again. Modern historians treat the specific historicity of this exact episode with real caution, some suspecting Procopius shaped it as much for its narrative punch as for strict documentary accuracy, though single combats of this general kind were a genuine, recognized feature of warfare in this era. True in every specific detail or not, it is a fitting overture for a battle about to be decided less by raw force than by exactly the kind of unconventional preparation nobody expected from the underdog side. Now feel the battle actually begin to turn. You watch the Persian cavalry force a crossing of the central trench, pushing back the Byzantine cavalry stationed to meet them directly. Dust rises in a solid wall along that crossing point, and for a genuine dangerous stretch of the fighting, the noise alone, hooves and shouting and the specific rhythm of men actually dying rather than simply drilling, tells you this could still go either way despite everything Belisarius has spent days preparing for. It looks, for those minutes, as though Persian numbers are finally going to tell exactly the way everyone expected them to before the battle began. That is precisely the moment Belisarius's hidden preparation pays off. Pharos's concealed Heruli cavalry breaks from ambush and strikes the advancing Persian wing from a direction it never anticipated, while a separate force of Hunnic cavalry under a commander named Sunicus attacks from within the Byzantine line at nearly the same moment. Caught between an expected enemy in front and an unexpected one from the side, the Persian wing that had just seemed on the verge of breaking the entire Byzantine position instead collapses and falls back in disorder. Perez responds by committing his single most feared weapon to restore the momentum his army has just lost. He sends forward the Jayadan, the legendary Immortals, elite Persian heavy cavalry, whose reputation alone had broken the will of enemies for generations before this specific afternoon. Belisarius meets that commitment with his own reserve, his personal retinue of elite cavalry known as the Bucelari, held back specifically for exactly this kind of moment rather than committed earlier in the fighting. The clash between Belisarius's reserve and Persia's most elite unit does not simply hold. It splits the Persian force in two, breaking apart a formation that had, only minutes earlier, represented the single greatest threat on the entire battlefield. if watching a numerically inferior young commander break his enemy's most elite unit using nothing but a held reserve and near-perfect timing interests you the way it interests us, that same kind of decision-by-decision history is exactly what our members get first, and uncut. By the time the fighting actually ends, the Persian army that had marched toward Dara expecting an easy victory over an outnumbered defender instead retreats in genuine defeat. Procopius, the near-contemporary historian whose account remains our primary source for this entire battle, records Persian losses at roughly 8,000 dead, including a substantial number of the Immortals, whose reputation this defeat badly damages, and Baresmanas himself, one of the two Persian commanders Kavadh had placed jointly in charge of this entire campaign, is killed in the fighting alongside them. That specific figure comes down to us through a single source rather than multiple independent confirmations. The same caution this channel applies to every ancient casualty count regardless of which side it favours. But the underlying outcome itself, a genuine, complete Byzantine victory against a considerably larger Persian force, is not seriously disputed by any account of this engagement. That single source is worth understanding a little more closely, because the man writing it is not a distant chronicler working from rumour. Procopius had joined Belisarius's staff as a legal advisor and secretary 3 years earlier, and by this point in Belisarius's career, was travelling with him closely enough to describe these campaigns essentially as an eyewitness, continuing on with him through the African and Italian campaigns still years away at this point. That same Procopius, later in life, would go on to write 2 dramatically different accounts of this same circle of people. His public history of the wars, generally favourable and detailed, the very source most of this battle's specifics come from, and a separate, deliberately unpublished manuscript known to history as the Secret History, in which he turns with genuine venom on nearly everyone he had spent years serving, savaging Justinian, the Empress Theodora, and even Belisarius and his own wife Antonina with an honesty he clearly never intended anyone in power to actually read during his own lifetime. The same eyewitness giving us this battle's most detailed, trusted account also privately despised, on some level, several of the very people he is describing here at their best. What Dara actually secures at the level of grand strategy is real, even if it does not resolve the underlying conflict permanently. The wider war this battle belongs to, generally remembered as the Iberian War, formally ends the following year with a treaty both sides optimistically name the Eternal Peace, terms genuinely favourable to Byzantium, keeping its territory intact and securing Persian recognition of Byzantine influence over the contested Caucasus region of Massacre. The peace this treaty promises turns out to be considerably less than eternal. Fighting between the two empires resumes within less than a decade, a reminder that even a genuinely decisive battlefield victory, backed by an agreement both sides formally called permanent, rarely settles anything as completely as the language of the treaty itself claims to. What Dara actually secures beyond the immediate battlefield result is Belisarius's own reputation at the exact moment his career most needed one. A 25-year-old given his first major independent command has just delivered one of the most tactically sophisticated victories the Eastern Roman world will see in generations, and that reputation follows him directly into the years immediately afterward, years that will define exactly how much trust the Byzantine Emperor Justinian is willing to place in him going forward. That trust is tested almost immediately, and in circumstances considerably less glorious than a frontier battlefield. Only 2 years after Dara, in 532, serious riots break out in Constantinople itself, a genuine threat to Justinian's own hold on power. The crisis itself grows out of something that sounds almost trivial next to the war just described. A violent rivalry between Constantinople's 2 dominant chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, that spirals into a genuine attempt to overthrow Justinian entirely. Belisarius, present in the capital alongside a fellow general named Mundus, is given command of the troops that ultimately end that crisis, and the manner in which it ends is not a triumphant rescue so much as a brutal, decisive massacre. Byzantine soldiers seal every exit of the city's hippodrome, where thousands of rioters had gathered, and kill nearly everyone trapped inside. A death toll historians place at somewhere near 30,000 people, securing Justinian's throne through overwhelming, deliberate force rather than negotiation. The same tactical decisiveness that had broken a Persian army at Dara is turned, within 2 years, against Justinian's own rebellious subjects, a considerably darker application of the exact same skill set. Belisarius's reputation, forged at Dara and then hardened by his role in Constantinople's own crisis, earns him command of an even more ambitious campaign the following year. That whole campaign fits inside Justinian's own, much larger ambition. a project later historians would come to call Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire, an attempt to physically reclaim the Western Roman territories lost to Germanic kingdoms generations earlier, rather than simply accept their loss as permanent. Belisarius becomes the actual instrument of that ambition. In 533, Justinian sends him with a comparatively modest force to reclaim Vandal-held North Africa. Belisarius enters Carthage itself that September, defeats the Vandal king Gelimer decisively that December at the Battle of Trachamarum, and accepts Gelimer's full surrender the following spring, completing the reconquest of an entire established kingdom in roughly 9 months, a speed that would have seemed almost impossible for anyone whose reputation had not already been established on the trench-lined field outside Dara 3 years earlier. One popular story about how Belisarius's own long career eventually ended deserves a direct correction, because it has shaped his reputation for far longer than the actual facts of his life ever supported. Centuries of later legend claim that Justinian, in a fit of jealous ingratitude late in Belisarius's life, had him blinded and reduced to begging for coins on the streets of Constantinople, a morality tale about fortune's cruelty that romantic painters and poets kept retelling well into the 19th century. The earliest source for that specific story dates from more than 500 years after Belisarius actually died, and serious historians reject it accordingly. What really happened is less dramatic but still genuinely sad in its own right. In 562, decades after Dara, Belisarius fell from favour, faced accusations of corruption, and was briefly imprisoned before Justinian pardoned him and restored his standing at court. He died a free man, roughly 60 years old, in 565, only months before the emperor he had served for most of his adult life. So think back to that battlefield, to a trench system built specifically to turn a numerical disadvantage into a genuine tactical advantage. You were never simply watching one more frontier skirmish between two ancient empires. You were watching a 25-year-old commander, given his very first independent command against odds that should have ended his career before it properly began, choose earthworks and a hidden ambush over simply hoping his smaller force could somehow match Persian numbers directly. A bath attendant may or may not have killed 2 Persian champions before the real fighting even started. A secretary who owed his entire career to the man he was writing about would later, in private, tear that same man's reputation apart in a manuscript he never intended anyone to read while he was alive. A peace both empires called eternal lasted less than a decade. And centuries after Belisarius actually died quietly, restored to honour, a legend insisted on blinding him and putting him on the street instead, because that ending felt more truthful to the storytellers than the considerably less dramatic reality ever did. The victory at Dara did not stay contained to that single afternoon. It built the reputation that would go on to crush a rebellion in Constantinople's own hippodrome, and then reconquer an entire kingdom in less time than most campaigns spend simply preparing to begin. Dara was never really about Belisarius surviving one dangerous day. It was the day the rest of his entire career actually became possible. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the legends checked against what the sources can actually support, the young commanders who outthought empires many times their own size, the victories that quietly built everything that came after them. There's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with it.